You had no idea how bad Custer's last stand really got. 210 men under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rode the high ground east of the Little Bighorn on the afternoon of June 25, 1876, certain they were about to deliver a crushing blow. By the time the sun dropped toward the Bighorn Mountains, every one of them was dead. Not in some neat ring of defiance holding a hill until the last round. They died in fragments, company after company, falling back along a half-mile ridge while Lakota and Cheyenne warriors closed from every coulee and draw. Men ran and were shot down from behind. Others killed their own mounts and crouched behind the carcasses until the circle closed and the firing stopped. What the relief column found 2 days later was only the wreckage. The real story is how completely and how quickly that command came apart, and how the man at the center of it had spent a lifetime building the confidence that carried him straight into the trap. George Armstrong Custer was 36 years old that summer, still the golden boy of the Army to many, still the man who had risen from last in his West Point class to the youngest general in the Union Army during the Civil War. He had led charge after charge with the Michigan Brigade, saber high, long yellow hair streaming, a figure the newspapers loved. After Appomattox, he kept the reputation alive on the plains. He fought the Cheyenne at the Washita in 1868, rode hard through the Black Hills in 1874, and never stopped believing that boldness and speed would carry the day. He dressed the part even on campaign: buckskin jacket, wide-brimmed hat, sometimes a red necktie, though by 1876 the famous hair was cut shorter. He brought his family along when he could. His brother Tom, a two-time Medal of Honor winner and captain in the 7th, rode with him that day. Civilian brother Boston had tagged along for the summer. Nephew Harry Armstrong Oddie Reed, just 18, had come out from Michigan for the adventure. Brother-in-law Lieutenant James Calhoun commanded Company L. Custer liked surrounding himself with men who shared his name and his hunger for distinction. That hunger had already cost him once, court-martialed in 1867 for leaving his post without orders, but the Army needed aggressive officers on the frontier, and he was restored to command. On the morning of the 25th, his Crow and Arikara scouts climbed the rocky outcrop called the Crow's Nest and stared down the valley of the Little Bighorn. They told him the village was the largest they had ever seen. One scout said there were more Sioux than the regiment had bullets. Custer climbed up himself, but claimed he could not make out the full extent through the morning haze. Whether he truly could not see it, or simply refused to accept the scale, he chose not to wait for the rest of General Terry's column. He had been ordered to feel out the enemy and wait for support. Instead, he pushed forward. Glory and the chance to end the campaign before the nation's centennial celebrations closed in Philadelphia weighed on him. He divided the 7th Cavalry into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno would strike the southern end of the village with 3 companies. Captain Frederick Benteen would scout the bluffs to the left with 3 more. Custer himself took 5 companies, C, E, F, I, and L, roughly 210 officers and men, and swung north along the high ground, planning to hit the camp from the opposite end while the women and children fled into his path. He still believed the Indians would scatter once pressed. That had been the pattern in earlier fights. This time, the village held more than 8,000 people and somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, many of them already angry over broken treaties and earlier attacks. Sitting Bull's people and the bands following Crazy Horse and Gall had gathered for the summer hunt and for mutual protection. They were not running. Custer's column moved along the bluffs after Reno's attack had already begun. From a point overlooking the valley, he could finally see the lodges stretching for miles. He sent Sergeant Daniel Knipe back with a verbal order for the pack train to hurry, then a short time later dispatched trumpeter Giovanni Martini with a written note for Benteen. "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs." Martini was the last man from that battalion to see Custer alive and ride away. The 5 companies continued north. At Medicine Tail Coulee, Custer split them once more. Captain George Yates took companies E and F down the dry creek bed toward a ford that looked open enough to reach the river and the heart of the camp. Captain Miles Keogh held companies C, I, and L higher on the ridges, ready to support or to block any countermove. Yates's detachment pushed toward the water. A handful of warriors appeared on the far bank and opened fire. The troopers hesitated, then turned and climbed back out of the coulee toward the high ground. That retreat set the pattern for everything that followed. Keogh's men linked up with them on the southern nose of the long ridge that runs parallel to the river, the ground later called Battle Ridge. Company L under Calhoun formed a skirmish line across the crest. Company C tried to clear the lower slopes and the ravines. Company I under Keogh took position a little farther north and east. Custer and the headquarters group, with Yates's remaining men, pushed farther along the ridge toward the northern tip. The warriors who had finished driving Reno back across the river now swung north in force. Gall's Lakota came up from the south through the draws. Others crossed lower down the valley and worked into the deep ravines that cut the western face of the ridge. From those folds they could fire without being seen. Arrows dropped in high arcs onto the exposed skirmish lines. Repeating rifles, Winchesters and Henrys taken from earlier fights and traders, cracked from the cover of Greasy Grass Ridge and the edges of Deep Coulee. Calhoun's line held for a stretch of steady firing, perhaps 20 or 30 minutes. Then the pressure from three sides broke it. Troopers began falling back along the crest. Spent cartridge cases later mapped by archaeologists show the neat firing positions dissolving into scattered clusters, the clear mark of men no longer in formation. Company C was overrun on the lower slopes. Survivors scrambled toward Calhoun Hill and were cut down before many of them reached it. Keogh's Company I tried to form a new line on the eastern face of the ridge. The bodies were later found close together around Keogh himself, as if the men had closed ranks one last time and been swamped. Horses stampeded in every direction. Some troopers still mounted tried to push north toward Custer. Most never made it. The command was folding in on itself, each company collapsing into the next under fire that came faster than the single-shot Springfields could answer. From the north came the decisive blow. Crazy Horse had led a large body of warriors down the valley, crossed the river below the village, and swung wide to climb the ridge from the opposite end. They hit the northern companies while Gall's men pressed from the south. The remaining soldiers under Custer and Yates were forced onto the highest point of the ridge, a low knoll that would be remembered as Rast Stand Hill. About 40 men reached it. They shot the last of their horses and dragged the carcasses into a rough circle. Behind that barrier they fired until the ammunition began to run low. Custer was among them, still in the thick of it, with his brothers and nephew close by. Tom Custer fought near him. Boston and young Audie Reed had no military rank, but stayed with the headquarters group to the end. The final rush came in a mass. Warriors rode close enough to strike one another's ponies with quirts, so no man held back. Low Dog's call carried across the slope. This was a good day to die. The charge rolled over the dead horses. Some soldiers threw down their carbines and raised their hands. The warriors took no male prisoners that day. A handful of troopers broke outward and ran on foot or on the few remaining mounts toward the river, sliding into the deep ravine that drops off the western side of the hill. They were hunted down one by one. Bodies later recovered from that ravine showed most had been shot from behind while still moving. The entire sequence, from the first shots at Medicine Tail Ford to the last man on the ridge, lasted less than 2 hours. Some native accounts put the final collapse at closer to 45 minutes once the pressure became continuous. Reno's and Benteen survivors held their hill through the next day under constant fire, short of water, digging with knives and tin cups until the relief column arrived. The story that grew afterward turned the disaster into a legend of defiance. Paintings of Custer standing tall with saber raised, newspapers calling it a martyr's stand against impossible odds. Elizabeth Custer spent the rest of her long life protecting that image. The ground itself tells a harder truth, a battalion that came apart under fire, company after company, until nothing remained but the dead and the wind moving through the grass on a ridge that still carries the name of the man who led them there. So the man remembered for over a century as a martyr riding bravely into an unwinnable fight was by every piece of physical and testimonial evidence recovered from that hillside, a career officer chasing one last headline to save a reputation already collapsing back in Washington, leading exhausted men in stages towards a village nearly 10 times larger than the one he expected, in a war started over gold that was never his government's to take. The ridge above the Little Bighorn didn't just end with Custer's death that afternoon. In less than 90 minutes, spread across 5 companies and nearly 1.5 miles of hillside, it ended, permanently the story America had spent a century telling itself about how that land was won, and what forensic teams eventually pulled out of that ground told a truer one than any painting ever did.